So it seems like you guys have a lot of interest in these Dragon Ball Super side chapters, as we've already discussed how Cell Juniors exist in Dragon Ball Super, and also a side chapter as to how Future Gohan survived the android attack when he was a kid. And in today's video, we are going to discuss the side chapter on how Future Trunks and Future Mai almost stayed in the present timeline. Now it starts off with Future Trunks and Mai having a conversation with Bulma, and it basically states that a few days after battling Zamasu and having lost the future to return to, Trunks is basically preparing to live in the present. Bulma states there are plenty of rooms for you to stay in here, so pick whichever one you like, and Mai questions whether or not Bulma minds her actually being there. Bulma responds by saying not at all. You are more than welcome, in fact. I've only had my Trunks here with me, so it'll be great having you around, kind of like a daughter. And you can see in this scene right here that Kid Trunks in the present timeline basically states, cool, now we can now hang out forever, as obviously as we look at Kid Mai's expression, it seems like both of them were rather excited for the future versions of themselves to live with them in the present timeline like a big brother and a big sister. But out of nowhere, we see Gohan coming in to ruin the show, and he states, is that you, Trunks? And then he continues by saying, oh boy, it really is you, why didn't anybody tell me? So it does seem like Gohan just bumped into Trunks by accident and that this wasn't originally planned. Then Trunks responds by saying, Gohan, why are you here? And this is the point where it starts to get interesting because Gohan mentions, well, I actually started training in the gravity chamber a little while ago. You see, these days nobody gives me a call when it's time to fight. I should keep myself from getting rusty just in case. Trunks states that should make sense. Trunks makes a comment that kinda doesn't really make sense because it's like, it's Gohan all grown up, he looks just like my Gohan from the future. It's because if you look at it from the anime perspective, Trunks had already seen Gohan, so it wouldn't make sense for him to make that comment again. It's Gohan all grown up like he's seeing him for the first time in a long time. Because he had already seen him, and obviously we remember the scene that they shared together with obviously Gohan, Trunks, and Pan. But Gohan then naively states, I guess your world's also pretty peaceful with you around, right? I'd love to visit sometime, now that you've saved the future and all. And this is where we get the breaking point. Trunks basically feels guilty and says the peaceful future that I saved, and it is at this moment where Bulma obviously acknowledges that Gohan's extremely naive to the situation, and Gohan continues just putting more acid in the wound by saying, so how long are you staying here? And he says, we're probably going to head back in 2 or 3 days, and obviously you can see that this wasn't what they were planning on doing after they had changed their mind, because Mai says, huh. So obviously they had already agreed to stay in the present timeline. Then Trunks states, well, I'm afraid I can't invite you to the future right now, but one of these days, yeah, I'll show you how peaceful it really is. Really looking forward to it. But Gohan once again hits us with more naivete as he says, I can't wait to meet your version of Bulma, which you can obviously see Trunks' reaction to it, as obviously Gohan's not fully aware of what happened to Bulma, even though technically Bulma would be okay because obviously, if they go back in time before any of this happened, then Bulma should be alive. So this scene kinda doesn't fully make sense because technically Bulma would be able to see Gohan if he did make a visit after Trunks had already fixed the future, but I guess in the moment, since that timeline has not been visited by Trunks, he's reacting in this particular way. But either way, we see in the last panel that Bulma basically says, you are as insensitive as your father sometimes, and basically Trunks says, my change of plans, let's go back to the future before it was destroyed, and you can see Mai saying sure, as she obviously wasn't expecting this. And ultimately we see it close off by saying, and that was how Trunks decided to return to his peaceful future before Zamasu ever appeared. But because there are some key differences between this side chapter, the original Trunks manga arc ending, and even the Dragon Ball Super anime, it's imperative that we go to chapter 26 so that we can make a direct comparison. Now, a key difference between Future Trunks in the anime versus the manga is the fact that he was a direct apprentice to the Supreme Kai, whereas in the anime this was non-existent. And because of this, we saw at numerous points throughout the manga variation of the Trunks Zamasu arc that he was able to heal our heroes. And speaking of the Supreme Kai, for number 2, it's important for us to mention that the Supreme Kai died completely differently in that timeline versus how he died in the anime variation, because in the manga variation, the Supreme Kai basically died when Babidi and Daburo showed up, and in his dying moments he basically spoke to Trunks. Whereas in the anime variation, the Supreme Kai basically died when Goku Black was just basically hunting down all of the gods, which ultimately led to Beerus dying too. And because of this, the plan was changed between the anime and the manga as to what Trunks and Mai wanted to do. The original plan was to basically warn Beerus about Zamasu when we look at the anime variation, but when we compare this to the manga, the plan is now that they would stop the Supreme Kai from dying in the first place so that Beerus never died, because obviously if Trunks can kill Babidi and Dabura before anything bad happened, and considering the fact that obviously Trunks is stronger now, then if he can kill them before anything happened, then the Supreme Kai would have never died and everything would have been better. It is important to note that even if Trunks did get somewhat stronger in the manga variation, that he was nowhere near as strong as what he was in the anime variation, where he actually unlocked a totally different form. But if he did get stronger at least somewhat, then obviously it would make it a lot easier to just stop Zamasu and Dabura, and if he knows what they're going to do ahead of time, then that also gives him another advantage, because he can prepare for them in the first place, especially if he has two Trunkses to work with this time around, whereas before he didn't. Now, it's also important to mention that because Future Trunks was an apprentice of the Supreme Kai, the Supreme Kai gives him the opportunity to become his apprentice in the main timeline, to which Trunks refuses as he feels like he was never able to enjoy the luxuries of life, and obviously he made his decision to go back to the future. And last but not least, the last major difference between the anime and the manga, and specifically this was explained in the side chapter, is that in the anime it was Mai that originally initiated that she and Trunks live in the future timeline again and live with the duplicate of themselves, whereas in the side chapter, as we just showed, it was actually Trunks this time around that basically made the decision for them to go back to the future timeline and live with the duplicate versions of themselves, whereas Mai was the one who was content living in the present timeline, and Trunks obviously felt guilty and decided to go back. But for now, I'm going to explain to you guys a minor inconsistency that Dragon Ball Super had that literally 99.99% of Dragon Ball fans would not notice unless you were a Dragon Ball YouTuber that was analyzing this to such extremes for you guys to watch on YouTube. And this super nitpicky inconsistency is actually dealing with the amount of time that had passed. You see, the side chapter takes place in the original 2-day gap before Trunks and Mai left. This side chapter implies that at some point Trunks and Mai had changed their minds and were deciding on living in the present. But the minor inconsistency comes in when we actually look at the conversation that Trunks had with Gohan. Because this side chapter had already mentioned that 2 days had passed, and then Trunks mentions to Gohan that he was planning on leaving in an extra 2 or 3 days, this directly contradicts the manga that only said 2 days had passed, because with this side chapter it would be 4 or 5. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed this extremely entertaining part of the video that explains such a minor inconsistency that almost no Dragon Ball fan on the planet ever probably cared about or even knew about. And last but not least, just to tie everything up full circle, it is kind of oddly interesting that this side chapter perfectly fits into the Dragon Ball Super anime, as we see a direct explanation of how Gohan was eventually flying over to say goodbye to Trunks for the last time. Because if Gohan knew exactly when Trunks was planning on leaving, it would make sense for him to fly over and rush to try and see Trunks before he left, which would obviously mean that Gohan was self-aware of when Trunks was planning on leaving, and because of the conversation that was explained into this side chapter, it would make sense how Gohan figured out exactly when Trunks was gonna go back. But what about all of you who were curious about what would have actually happened if Trunks and Mai had actually stayed in the present timeline? Well, don't worry, because your Uncle Qaaman has a solution for you. Years ago, I did a video that holds up very well to this day on what if Trunks and Mai actually stayed. For those of you who correctly guessed, if you have Future Trunks on your side, then that means you wouldn't have to recruit Frieza. And if Future Trunks participates in the Tournament of Power, that would definitely change the balance of things because he has a directly positive relationship with the majority of our characters, if not all of our characters, and that's a deep contrast to Frieza. The only characters that Trunks would have some beef with would be obviously the androids, but obviously in that particular situation, the androids were better in this timeline, so the beef wouldn't be as bad as compared to Frieza, who literally killed some of the members of the Tournament of Power directly. So overall, guys, this is essentially the story of how Trunks and Mai almost stayed in the present timeline.